There has been a ton of debate over 6v6 versus 5v5 in Overwatch 2, and whether or not Blizzard will actually implement 6v6 or revert Overwatch back to how it was back in Overwatch 1 with 6 players on each team. Now, in this video, I'm going to argue that Blizzard will eventually bring back 6v6, but how they do it is going to be interesting. It's not going to be soon, and there is a double-edged sword here that we have to talk about, this elephant in the room that could change everything or even just kill Overwatch flat out. But it says that only 20% of you are subscribed, so if you haven't subscribed, press it right now and let's get into it. Now, before we talk about why 6v6 is coming back, in my opinion, and the problems that come along with it, let's talk about how we even got here in the first place. Well, when we moved to Overwatch 2, 5v5 got announced, and originally there were a lot of pros to the idea of 5v5. We just got off the back of GOATs and Double Shield and some other metas that we didn't really like. Yeah, it wasn't the fault of the 6v6, it was the fault of the balance, but still, that was kind of at the top of everyone's mind, so to speak, at the time. 6v6 was offered as something that was going to be faster paced, more FPS adjacent, and not something that feels more like a MMO or a MOBA, and with added ability to carry as an individual. These were all the things that were promised to us and all the things that looked good from the outside looking in before any of us really got to try 5v5 at all. So while going into Overwatch 2 kind of felt like Overwatch 1.5 or a little bit cosmetic, this was a huge change to the core gameplay that I think a lot of people were optimistic of at first, and even after we started playing it, a lot of people liked it generally. I really liked it. Most people that you could talk to in the second season of the game, and especially in beta, they liked 5v5 as a system. Now, over time though, some of the cracks started to get revealed. Some of the problems start to get revealed, right? I think one of the big things is there was a huge skill gap in the support role for a lot of players. You got away with not being a DPS or damage centric or playmaking centric support in most ranks back in Overwatch 1, but when we go into Overwatch 2, all of a sudden you have to be really proactive with the amount of damage you're doing, the amount of plays you're doing. Healing overall mattered a lot less, so damage and making these plays mattered a ton more, and people just didn't really do that. I mean, even in Overwatch 1, even in the Grandmaster and top 500 ranks, even in like 4300 plus, a lot of supports got there by not really being that proactive, because you got a lot of value by playing fairly passive overall, and that is one of the reasons why I think especially support players struggled the most going into Overwatch 2. And then to counteract a lot of these so-called problems, we saw massive buffs to the support role as a whole, and I think that a lot of these buffs were probably too soon. They were actually far too soon in my opinion, because people that were proactive, really aggressive, and could play make already thrived in Overwatch 2 compared to Overwatch 1, because you had a lot more of that time, that space, that agency to do those things. If you were an aggressive player, you had more room to be even more aggressive and not get punished for it, because back in Overwatch 1, there were smaller windows of time where you could not carry your front line, carry your tanks, carry your team. There were more people to heal overall, and this meant that you could be less aggressive, or you had to be, or else you would get punished. Your team, someone would die, or whatever the case may be. So my argument here is that Blizzard actually buffed a role too soon instead of allowing people to adapt to the role's changes overall. But then, once people got used to being more proactive, being better mechanically, being someone that wants to deal more damage as a support, we saw another problem where the support role was far too powerful. It was being too strong, and they had to buff other things to kind of bring it in line. And then another problem finally got realized, which is if the support role is being proactive and damage dealing, and they have all this utility, and the damage role is being proactive and trying to deal damage, then all of a sudden that solo tank is kind of on an island, isolated, the target of all pieces of utility, the person that is going to get bullied the most with all sorts of abilities and fire. And to compensate that power gap, they had to dramatically buff the tanking role. But then we ended up in this problem, and the problem was because there was a solo tank, it was obvious that you could swap either individual characters or other tanks could swap to counteract the central character that a team composition plays around, and that was the tank. So you were in a situation where you had to buff the tanks dramatically in order to keep them alive and make it so that they don't just fall over being the target of all this type of utility and damage, but at the same time, these characters could still get counteracted. So yes, you're not dying, you're still able to play the game as a tank player, more or less, but you're not having a great experience. You're not having a fun experience. Most of the time, you're playing to exist. You're not playing to playmake. You're not playing to do anything. You're playing not to die, and this created a counter swap game loop and a raid boss play style that really was not the favorites for a lot of people. And I want to make it clear here that not everyone hates this style of play. And the reason is because this just taxes you on a different form of skill. And what I mean by that is if you're someone that is really flexible, you have the ability to swap, you have the ability to play optimized picks, you look at the game from a more top-down point of view and say, oh, these are the weak points, I can play these characters really well, I can actually play a character that my opponent can't play as well as me, and I can shut down their whole strategy. This is what could actually happen back in 6v6 in the scrim level where whole teams could swap. You can do that a lot more on an individualistic level if you're someone that's very flexible in 5v5. But for the people that just want to play the game, lock a character, and just enjoy the game and play the game, they don't want to swap all the time, or they don't want to play the counter swap game, or they just don't like it. Like, flexibility is not something they play Overwatch for. They play for all the other reasons that you play Overwatch, all the crazy playmaking, all the crazy abilities, the movement, all that. They're not going to like it comparatively. And I'm not here to argue if one is right or wrong, right? What I am saying, though, is that the way that 5v5 has finally settled is extremely polarizing. Like, we've saw a ton of buffs and nerfs and changes to the system, but it's settled in the loop, the gameplay loop, that it will most likely stay for its life cycle. We've gotten to a point where the skill levels of players have risen to the point where everyone's playing their role appropriately. And while a lot of people will cite old parts of Overwatch 2 as being incredibly fun or different or whatever, I would argue that there were skill checks back then that didn't make it so 5v5 played out how it would play out now. Even if we got reverted to like the early days of Overwatch 2 patch, it would play out fundamentally different because the entire community have learned different, played different. I mean, the core basic strategy of how you played Overwatch 1 was different than Overwatch 2, and it took a lot of learning to get to that point as a community collectively. So now I'm saying, in spite of all their recent changes, we're in a settled 5v5 where this is the way the game is going to play for the foreseeable future. And you're either going to be someone that likes this, or you're going to be someone that hates it. But the thing here is that, unfortunately for Blizzard, people have something to compare it to, which was 6v6. And I'm going to talk about 6v6's problems in a second, but when you have something different, a very different experience to compare it to, that is possible to go back to, hypothetically, that's where the problems come from. Like, if 5v5 was the only thing introduced, and it was just like it is now, people would enjoy it. People would still like it. I think Overwatch still would have been a big and successful game. But when you have something else that requires a different set of skills, it has a completely different gameplay loop, and encourages different types of gameplay overall to compare it to, and it's polarizing to the point where a large population of people like that better, that's where you get into the situation we're in now, where a whole bunch of people like 5v5 and a whole bunch of people like 6v6. Sometimes if you don't even know what you're missing, then you're going to be complacent. But once you know that there's something that you're missing, that's where you get mad. And that's kind of the situation that Blizzard is in right now, where people know what they're missing, or they know what they like, and it's not what's being given to them right now. But to be fair here, I don't want to just keep the rose-tinted glasses, the nostalgia goggles on the entire time, because I remember 6v6's problems. There were a lot of problems in 6v6. Queue times was a huge one, especially as the population of the game started to decline. We saw really, really bad queue times in 6v6, and I'm sorry, but that's a problem no matter how you slice it. Now, are there solutions to that problem? Absolutely. I think they could do a better ticket system. I think that if we ever go back to 6v6, it should probably be like introducing 5 new tank characters at the same time. I think that would have been a fantastic thing, because still, one of the biggest problems that we have had since the beginning is the fact that when Overwatch first came out, they had attack and defense DPS, and they had about a fourth of every character. They had a fourth of the characters as tank, fourth of the characters as attack, fourth of the characters as defense, and fourth of the characters as support, relatively, right? But still more than others attack and defense. But guess what? Turns out attack and defense is like a non-name. It's just all DPS, and none of that matters. So It just made it so there was a huge amount of DPS relative to tanks and supports, and that is a huge problem when tanks automatically gonna be less interesting or less popular than DPS, and then you just give DPS like 4 times as many characters. It's just the biggest mistake that Blizzard made since the beginning of Overwatch is to do that and not understand the attack defense nature of the game. Made no sense at the time. They should have designed way more tank characters and way more support characters right at the beginning of the game. So there could be a solution to just create a lot more tank characters and make the role more fun with more interesting types of characters, and that could solve the queue times. I'm not saying the queue times is unsolvable. In fact, I think that Blizzard did the worst possible things that they could have done to solve queue times I could possibly imagine since the beginning of Overwatch, so I'm not giving them a pass here or anything like that, and I'm not saying the problem isn't unsolvable with 5v5, but as is, it is a problem, and it would need to be addressed if we ever went back to 6v6. And another thing is that Overwatch just played completely different. Like, what was required of you was completely different in the game. It was more of a MOBA than an FPS, and it had a lot less in common with games like Apex, where now it's actually not that far off, especially if you're playing DPS and support. It feels a lot more in line with an FPS, as opposed to back then, where it was far more cooldown and ultimate based, where now, like, ultimates are kind of like an afterthought. I mean, they're powerful, but nowhere near as strong or as important as they were in 6v6, where ult combos were incredibly important, especially in ranked, where now they're just really not even close to the same extent. And this changes like the entire way that the game is played, and it's opinion. Like, how you like your game to be played, how you like your game to play, is gonna be an opinion. Like, not everyone is gonna like this better than 5v5, and there's also certain metas in 6v6 that I think people would absolutely hate. And there's a lot of people that watch this channel and just in general that never really played Overwatch 1. And while there are definitely gonna be metas that you're gonna think are amazingly fun, because those exist, there are a ton of metas that were very frustrating and in a lot of ways similar or even worse than some of the worst metas that we've ran into in 5v5. So it's not like Overwatch 6v6 didn't have its problems, because it did. And I want to kind of paint both sides of the picture here, that there were a lot of problems in 6v6, and I imagine when we go back, there will still be a lot of problems in 6v6, undoubtedly. And remember, the whole argument I'm making is that we will go back, but we'll get to that in a second. Now, the biggest problem, I think, overall with 6v6, and the biggest problem we'd run into, is about the tank synergies and anti-synergies. Because synergies with tanks were like the bread and butter of Overwatch, but anti-synergies on tanks were very frustrating. One of the most frustrating things that you had to deal with when you had anti-synergies on your team, you know, really weird combinations of like Hog Diva or, you know, like Hammond or like basically any other tank. There's a lot of frustrating combos, and if you could kind of think about it like in Overwatch 1's terms, it's almost like, imagine if 2 characters together make up a full Overwatch 1 tank, but 2 anti-synergistic teams together, or characters together, make like half of a tank or less, right? That's what it felt like sometimes, where you got 2 tank players that didn't really want a tank, or they wanted to do their own thing, or they didn't want to synergize against 2 synergy tanks on the other team, and it's like worse than you could possibly imagine. Because at least in Overwatch 2 now, the tank is not needing to synergize with anyone. I mean, they're themselves, right? So if they want to play in a weird way, as long as they're doing what they want to do and getting value, it's okay. It's not great, but it actually works. But imagine if like 2 half characters are doing things both that don't affect each other in any way, and they have 0 synergy together. So they're getting like half of a character's value, and then the synergy is getting like more than a character's worth of value. It's a frustrating situation that people, I think, forgot how frustrating this was. It's frustrating. Now, don't get me wrong, I still would prefer 6v6 personally over 5v5, but once again, when we go back, because I do think we will go back, these are problems that somehow need to be solved. They have to be solved some way, or they have to be minimized. Because just like what we're in right now, where I think right now the community has kind of shifted to where maybe there's like 40% of people that are silent on the issue, but there's a pretty large amount of people, like maybe another 40 or 30% that want 6v6 back, and then the rest that want 5v5, so it's actually smaller people want 5v5. Still, if we go back to 6v6, hypothetically, we are in a situation where people have tried both, and then if people are going to complain about all these problems are going to pop up, the anti-synergies, the MOBA-like nature, the queue times, the poor balance, the bad metas, all that's going to pop up, and then you have a group of people that have tried something else, and once again will complain about where we're in, right? It's going to be a vicious cycle. No one's going to be happy. And that's why I actually think it was a terrible idea to ever introduce people to a different way to play the game. Like, the fact that they gave us 6v6 and then 5v5 was maybe the worst idea ever. Because now, if you go back, people have tried 5v5 and they might miss it, and then there's going to be problems. And if we stay in 5v5, people are going to know what 6v6 was like and miss it and see all the problems. So it's like, you shouldn't have gave people, you know, 2 types of ice cream and then say, oh, you have to pick one or whatever. Because some people are going to like one and some people like the other. And you can't give them fucking both, okay? And it's kind of actually funny. Like, I'm a dad now. I don't talk about this much, but like, if you give your kid like a snack, any snack, like a dessert snack, let's say a fruit roll-up or something, they're gonna be happy. But if you give them like a different kind of snack, like ice cream and then a fruit roll-up, and then whenever you whip out like, hey, you want a snack, they're gonna always say, I want ice cream, even though they were perfectly happy with the freaking fruit roll-up. But because you showed them ice cream, they tasted ice cream, they love ice cream, every time you ask them for a snack, they're gonna want freaking ice cream. Okay, anyways, sorry. I'm getting on a completely different tangent. But let's talk about when Blizzard reverts this, what's gonna happen, what's the fallout look like, what are the problems, and why do I say there's a double-edged sword here? Well, first off, I'm really confident that Blizzard will eventually revert to 6v6, and I have a couple of strong reasons to believe this. The biggest one is that there is World of Warcraft Classic. That's the biggest one, where Blizzard has shown that they're willing to kind of put forward a project that plays off of the nostalgia of their franchise, of their games, right? But it did happen a lot longer in the game's life cycle than we're seeing right now, and it wasn't done like in response necessarily to like people getting pissed off and boycotting or being pissed off and not wanting to play. But it did happen, and Blizzard is capable of doing it, and they're also a company that is very profit centric, as we've seen. So they definitely have it on their radar. And the other piece that I would say, the reason that I think it's a no-brainer that they'll do it at some point, is the success of Fortnite. Look at what Fortnite did when it brought back many of the classic maps, it brought back many of the classic guns, and it just blasted people with nostalgia. The game just went nuts. It went crazy. So many people enjoyed it, and I'm sure the freaking producers up at Blizzard are like looking down at that and be like, wow, we could do this. We could easily do this. And they will. They definitely will do this. Both things will be true, but it's important to understand that there's a timeline here that I don't think we're even close to. And I also think that there are going to be consequences for going back, and we're just going to have to embrace them. So first off, it's important to understand that the internet is going to go nuts when and if Blizzard reverts back to 5v5. Like, while inside the community, the needle has been moving, and with people like Samito and others talking about 6v6, and there's a lot of people that are finally changing their minds. I think a lot of the community in Overwatch are really excited and happy at the idea of going back to 6v6. However, the outside of community, the people outside of Overwatch that are not playing it consistently, they don't feel that way at all. They think that it's a joke that PvP got canceled. It's a joke that Overwatch 2 was just kind of like a massive mistake. It's a joke that they went into 5v5 in the first place. And when Blizzard reverts, it's not going to be met with applause. Like, when Blizzard goes back to 6v6, they're not going to be like, wow, oh my god, they saw their flaws and we can go play the game again. No, they're going to point and laugh. They're going to point and laugh at the game. It's not like they are in the community and they understand some of the gameplay problems that we're experiencing. They don't see that. They are, from the outside looking in, they're like, wow, they don't know what the hell they're doing. They keep doing this, then they're doing that, then they're doing this, then they're reverting it. Like, they don't know what they're doing. The game's dead. That's what's going to happen. That's going to be the narrative. And while people from inside the community could be super happy, I don't really think it's going to push the needle to get people back unless they go extremely hard with the classic angle, right? And that would require us to like literally go back in time with like a timeline, and a lot of characters would get removed and make it so that characters would come out at a certain cadence, and you would have to literally make people feel like they're back in 2016 playing the game again. That would be the way to do it, but it could also backfire in a lot of ways, mainly because people get really attached to characters, and it's one of the reasons why you should rarely remove or dramatically change characters when it comes to hero shooters, because if someone gets really attached to a certain type of character, you want that person to be able to keep playing that character forever and even have a sub-community of that character. And it's one of the reasons why Blizzard makes such an effort to make it so that people's characters still function. Like when Junkrat got nerfed to the point where he didn't function, even though Junkrat was never really meta and not really played in the meta, he has a really popular sub-community that thrives and can experience a certain gameplay loop only in Overwatch. So they buffed him back to the point where those people were happy, because you don't want those people to leave the game. Like, if you create these subgroups that really enjoy playing certain characters and you remove those characters, those subgroups oftentimes just don't have a place to go. They don't want to play Overwatch. They want to play their character, their subgroup, right? And so if we go back in time, back to 2016, where Kiriko doesn't exist, or all these characters don't exist, and there's like a huge enjoyment of these characters, then all of a sudden you might lose people. And even though it's classic and they would bring a lot of hype, you could mess up your like loyal fan base potentially. So there is a potential downside, and I would say that this is a hard, tricky thing to do. I still think they're going to do it. I'm fairly certain they're going to do it. But it'd probably be put like on a different timeline where they would like reintroduce a lot of characters to the game under like a new timeline or something like that. And we would still have some of the old maps. People could still play on Hanamura. People could still, you know, hate their lives on 2CP in 6v6, but with all the new characters. And that's what they would have to do. And I think that they will eventually do that. But I also want to talk about a core difference between this and the reversion of other games. There is no going back here in the traditional sense, as in, once you do this, you're going to make the community even more split if you don't commit to one or the other. So like a reversion to 6v6 could not just be like a little blip. Like if you give people a week or a couple days of an event, people are just going to crave that more. Like, you're going to make this problem worse if you don't full commit to it eventually, which I think that they will do. I think they will actually full commit to it. And it can't be a situation where you play both 5v5 and 6v6. That cannot happen because you can't split the player base. You need as many people as possible playing the game so that you have enough people filling up the servers and there's not this queue time issue. So they have to decide. Like, they have to fully commit. If they do a classic like thing where it's like maybe an event around a reversion of time, classic, go back to 6v6, all these maps that are reimagined, a new timeline of characters, maybe it's like the original cast, but then the new characters get introduced really rapidly, but we stay in 6v6. That can happen, but we're not gonna go back then to 5v5. It would not happen that way. You can't do it anymore. So it's an all-in thing that is something that Blizzard has in their back pocket, but it's not something that they want to pull the trigger on right now. And this is kind of the full thing I wanted to talk about, and one of the things that I think a lot of you are going to get disappointed by. This is not going to happen anytime soon. This is the last resort for Blizzard. You got to think about all of these problems I talked about. You have to think about all the people that might potentially be unhappy. You got to think about all the backlash. You got to think about how big of a scope you would have to create in order to go back into 6v6. It's not just like they're going to flip a switch and then all of a sudden you can play 6 characters. No, it has to be dramatic balance changes. In my opinion, the only way to do it right is by making it an entire event where we're literally going back in time and playing on the old maps in old 2CP. There's a story narrative element to it. We have a different timeline of different characters coming out in different states with different balance at different moments. Like, they have to do so much here. It is a huge thing that they would do here, and they can't do it until it's like the last resort. And that's what I'm talking about. Like, it's gonna happen in my opinion, but do I think it's gonna happen even a year from now? No, I don't think it's gonna happen that soon. I think it's literally when Overwatch is on its last leg, when people like Samita, when people like Flats, when people like J3, all these people are just pissed off and they don't want to play the game anymore. They've moved on, they're trying other things, and the game is like on red alert. Boom, they hit us with the Overwatch Classic, the Overwatch Revival, the Overwatch Fusion, whatever the case may be, and then they do all that, and everyone comes back in, and all the hype, all the popularity, everything is back full front and center. But there's a lot of things that you could lose. You could lose a percentage of your audience that are loyal to characters. You could lose a percentage of your audience that are loyal to 5v5. You basically completely destroy the esport again. Like, there's all these problems that happen that don't make sense to pull the trigger on right now, where the game is not dead. Like, as much as we have problems with the game and we're frustrated about the game is still selling skins. It still has people playing the game. People are still grinding. Content is still getting views. Like, the game is not on red alert yet, and it's probably not going to be on red alert for a very long time, even in its current system. So we see all this floundering, we see all this fighting, we see all these problems, but only after all the people that have a problem with Overwatch have already left, completely left, gone, don't care about the game anymore, playing completely other games, that's when they'll hit us with something that will bring everyone back, and not a moment sooner than that. And I think for a lot of you, this might make you sad, this might make you upset, but, you know, maybe 2-3 years from now, then you can go enjoy Blizzard's true last resort when we go back to 6v6, but it's not going to happen anytime soon. And I also just think that no one should get their hopes up about this. If you don't enjoy the game the way it is, it's probably time to take a step back, because I highly doubt that they are going to do anything here. They're not even going to let us play 6v6, most likely, even as a trial run, because they know that once people get a taste, it will only increase the problems, the division, the polarization that is happening in the game right now. And yeah, it's just not the time for that yet, because the game is not on red alert yet, but it's always in their back pocket, and that you got to be sure that they're going to whip it out to cash in on that when the game needs it, when the game starts losing popularity. So yeah. Now, if you made it to the end, definitely let me know down below if you agree or disagree with things I've said and why. And tell me, do you like 5v5? Do you like 6v6? Do you think that this is a problem that can be solved in another way? I really am curious of your opinion down below. And if you enjoy the content, smash that like, subscribe. Thank you so much, and I'll see you next time.